Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bhunaktu, Sahaviryan Karava Vahai, Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Kataksha Kirana Chanta Naman Mohabdhaye Namaha Ananta Nanda Krishnaya Jagan Mangala Murtaye. Om. Very good. Welcome back. We continue our Vedanta study and our study of Advaita Makaranda. And before we pick up we'll begin today with this 20th verse. But before we begin, there was a question that came, and the question is so important. I want to address it because if this question continues in anyone's mind, everything we're doing here is a waste of time. So the question is, it says, when I say consciousness is the reason you are aware of the thoughts in the mind, who is the you in this statement? Now, there are a couple of problems here. One is he's misquoted me. I never said consciousness is the reason. I've always said, and I'm very careful in my choice of words here, consciousness is that by which you know what's happening in your mind. It's not a reason. Consciousness is not a reason. It's not an idea. It's not a concept. Consciousness is that by which you know what's happening in your mind. Last part of the question, who is the you in the statement? Now it becomes obvious. You are that consciousness. That's too, it's so obvious, but we don't get it. You are a conscious being. No one can argue with that statement. Indeed, you are a conscious being. As a conscious being, as that consciousness, you observe what's happening in your mind. So you are that consciousness by which whatever is happening in your mind is known. So he goes on, when we say that consciousness reveals the activity in your mind when you're awake or dreaming, consciousness reveals the lack of activity in dreamless sleep. Who is this activity or inactivity revealed to? Who is the observer? You are the conscious observer of the activity or inactivity of your mind. The problem here is a common one, and it's because almost everyone starts out with the idea that Atma, or consciousness, is a concept or an idea. There are several books and lectures entitled The Atma, using the English article the, T-H-E. There's no such thing as the Atma. Atma is not a thing. You say in Hindi, aur ek cheez. Aur ek cheez nahi hai. It's not one more thing in the world. Atma is you in your essential nature as consciousness. So, there's no the Atma. There's only your true nature, which is consciousness, which is Satchidananda Atma. Okay, important question. Now, having addressed that, we can return to our verses. Let's see verse 20. Chetyoparaga me, Chetyoparaga me, Sakshita Pinatattvaki, Sakshita Pinatattvaki, Upalakshanamevayam, Upalakshanamevayam, Nistarangachiram buddhehe, Nistarangachiram buddhehe. Good. As you know, each one of these verses address a particular doubt or confusion that can arise. And here we're talking about the relationship between observer and observed, between seer and seen, between drik and drishya, to use our Sanskrit terms, drik, seer, drishya, seen. And here we're going to use the word sakshi. Sakshi is witnessed, and sakshya, that which is witnessed. And here, instead of sakshya, the first word is chaitya. Chaitya is much less familiar. Chit, consciousness. Chaitya is object of consciousness. Just as sakshi is observer and sakshya is observed, here chait or chaitanya, chit or chaitanya is consciousness, and chaitya is the object of consciousness, which we'll see that in the first line in just a moment. Obviously, in every case, there's duality, and of course we're studying Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, so we have to resolve that duality, but there's a further issue, and that is, in your ordinary experience, it seems like whatever you observe affects you. When you see something really sad in a movie or on TV, it affects you. When you see something really happy, when you see a smiling little baby, it makes you happy. So whatever you experience, whatever you see, hear, taste, smell, touch, whatever you observe seems to affect you. And if that's the case, how can you possibly be free from suffering? The commentator introduces a word here, nirvikalpa chaitanya. Chaitanya, consciousness, same as chit. Nirvikalpa, free from vikalpa. Here vikalpa means change or modification. Nirvikalpa chaitanya is your true nature, not merely as consciousness, but unchanging consciousness, immutable consciousness. And this verse establishes the fact that your consciousness is in fact unchanging, immutable, according to use the commentator's word, nirvikalpa. Okay, let's see the verse starting in the second line, actually. Sakshita. Sakshi, you know, as observer. Sakshita is the state of being an observer. He says that state of being an observer, back up to the first line, me, for me. Remember, all these verses are in the first person making them suitable not only for manana, this very rational process of inquiry we're engaged in, but because they're all in the first person, they're also suitable for nididhyasana. Of course, our class is manana. We can't contemplate or meditate during class. That's your homework, of course, as you know. So instead of focusing on nididhyasana with this first person reference, we'll stay focused on manana, this process of inquiry. This process of removing doubts and vagueness. Me, for me, sakshita, the state of being a sakshi. And what about that state? He describes it as chaitya uparaga rupa. This is an adjective that describes sakshita, your state of being a witness who is not completely remote, a witness who's not uninvolved. That's a double negative. Shouldn't use double negatives, except Sanskrit uses it all the time. An observer, a witness who is observed, not a, the term that's often used is passive bystander. Well, when you are passively witnessing a terrible accident on the road, you're not exactly passive. You are emotionally engaged. So you're not really a passive bystander, you're an emotionally engaged bystander. The fact is that whenever you are a sakshi, a witness of something, you end up being affected by whatever you witness, and that's what this adjective means. Chaitya uparaga rupa. A sakshi whose rupa, whose nature, is to be uparaga. Notice you have to break the words apart properly. The sakshi whose rupa, whose nature is to be uparaga, tainted, affected. Literally colored, but colored doesn't make any sense here. So affected. Affected by what? Chaitya. I explained that word before. Whatever is an object of consciousness is chaitya. Whatever you observe, whatever you witness. So here in the first half he says, sakshita api also, this sakshita, the state of being an awareful witness, which is chaitya uparaga rupa, an awareful witness who is uparaga, who is affected or tainted by chaitya, by whatever is observed. That condition for me, that condition, na tattviki, is not absolutely real. And he's going to explain why it's not absolutely real as he continues. Now, we constantly say that Atma is Sakshi, but when we say that, that's not a final position. That's not a concluding statement. That's a statement en route to the goal. A simple metaphor here, the teachings of Vedanta are fairly elaborate, and there are many steps or stages. The goal is a very lofty one. So a metaphor comes that if the goal is very lofty, it's like coming to a wide stream, a stream that's too wide to jump over. So if you can't jump over the wide stream, like you can't jump into enlightenment, you have to go through these certain steps. So that wide stream can be crossed by means of several stepping stones. Now, when you are walking across these stepping stones to cross a stream, the crucial point is that you have to leave one stepping stone behind and when you cross over to the next. So you leave a stepping stone behind with each step. In the same way, in the teachings of Vedanta, you leave certain concepts behind as you proceed to the next step. So certain concepts, certain teachings, let me not use the word concept, certain teachings are absolutely conclusive, but certain teachings are like those stepping stones. They lead you in the direction of that final goal. For example, the most obvious one is you're not your body. Well, that certainly is not the conclusion of Vedanta. The conclusion of Vedanta is you are Satchidananda Atma, non-separate from Brahman, the reality of all. So when you say you are not your body, that's not the concluding statement of Vedanta. It's one of the many stepping stones. You're not your body is a stepping stone. You're not your five senses is a stepping stone. You're not the faculties of your mind is one more stepping stone. And we have to be ready to go beyond those stepping stones to reach the conclusive knowledge of Vedanta. And here, when Vedanta says you are a sakshi, or when Vedanta says consciousness, you as consciousness are the sakshi, the awareful witness of whatever is happening in your mind. That is a stepping stone. It's not the conclusive teaching. It's one of the many positions that are left behind. Now, he's going to explain that using a little bit more technical language. He says here, in the third line, upalakshanam eva iyam. He says iyam, this. Iyam, this position, this teaching, is upalakshanam eva, is an upalakshana, is eva merely, an upalakshana. Now we have to get into some language here. He said, lakshana, upalakshana, I've translated here, incidental attribute, which I'm not sure if that's helpful. That term itself is a little confusing. This idea of lakshana is something that's really crucial. So let me go to the board and explain it in some detail. So in teaching what your true nature is, we employ two kinds of lakshana. Now, lakshana, lakshana, I think in vernacular languages it can mean like a definition, and even in Sanskrit it sometimes means definition. But here we're using it in a more refined way. There's a root meaning of this word, which means to point, to indicate. So the best translation of lakshana is not definition. The best definition of lakshana is indicator. Spell it right. So a lakshana is an indicator, specifically something that indicates your true nature. And here we're going to differentiate between two major kinds of lakshana. One is swarupa lakshana, and the other is tatastha lakshana. These are very important terms. You may not have encountered this before. This is such an important topic. Swarupa lakshana is something that reveals your swarupa, something that reveals your true nature. Tatastha lakshana is something that indicates. Let me stay with indicator. So swarupa lakshana indicates swarupa, true nature. Tatastha lakshana indicates something which is tatastha. Now you have to know the Sanskrit a little bit here. Stha, standing, tata, literally on the bank is the literal meaning of it. Standing on the bank, something that is nearby. I'll give you the classical examples, and then I'll sit down and give you, I think, a better example. The typical example here is when you describe a house. You could say if you go into a village and you want to find out somebody's house, and you say, suppose you ask directions. I'm looking for this person's house. Which house is it? And a person might say, oh, it's the white one. So white house, the house is white. By the way, there's a limitation in this metaphor, this explanation, but I'll refine it in a few moments. So white house, the house is actually white. So in this metaphor, and again, this is not a great example, but it's a traditional one. The house is white. So that would be an example of a swarupa lakshana. That house is actually white. To contrast it with, suppose you say, which house does so-and-so live in? And a person says, oh, you see that house with the crow standing on the roof? It's that house. The house with the crow on it. Notice the crow is something completely independent of the house, unrelated to the house. In fact, it is something that's near the house. Tata on the bank literally means that suggests that which is near, that which is nearby. So the house with the crow is a good example of a tatastha lakshana, an indicator of something which is related, something which is near, as opposed to some surupa lakshana, which is something that indicates the essential nature, surupa of something. I'd like to give you, I think, a much better example. This is a traditional one. Okay, I'm back. So here's I think a better one. I can call this a clay pot. Even this idea also has errors in it. Any example, if you think that's one of the, just a quick aside, when you start using lots of logic, you can pretty much find a logical error in almost any statement you make. So at some point we have to use just enough logic to make the point. So if I say this is a clay pot, clay is a swarupa lakshana for the pot. After all, the nature, the swarupa, the essence of the pot is clay. So to call, actually there's no logical error here. To call this a clay pot is absolutely correct, because the word clay, and the logical problem, by the way, comes when we call clay the adjective in English, when we say clay pot. Clay is the adjective, pot is the substantive. But of course, you know there's a problem with that, and that is the clay is actually the substance. It's not an adjective, it's the actual substance. So in English, when we use the expression clay pot, the word clay is an adjective, and that position is actually faulty, because clay doesn't describe something arbitrary about it. Clay actually describes the swarupa, which is why we can say clay pot. Clay is a swarupa lakshana, a word that indicates the essence of the pot. And here's the contrast. So I just described the swarupa lakshana. Now let me describe a tatastha lakshana. Tatastha lakshana would be if I say, the pot in my hand. That's also a lakshana. It also indicates the pot. But notice it indicates the pot by calling your attention to something tatastha, something that's nearby, something that's not essentially connected to the pot. After all, you can see the pot without my hand. Right now you see the pot with my hand. Like in the earlier example, you can see the house with the crow on, but then the crow flies away. So in the incidental attribute, that's what that word incidental means in this translation. So the crow is an incidental attribute of the house. The pot in my hand is an incidental attribute of the pot. But if we say clay pot, we're using a swarupa lakshana. Now that you understand these two words, let's apply to how we understand Atma. When we say Atma is Sat Chit Ananda, these words Sat Chit Ananda are swarupa lakshana. The words Sat Chit Ananda indicate the swarupa, the essence of Atma. On the other hand, when we say Atma is Sakshi, Sakshi means something other than Atma, which is being observed. So to say Sakshi, it means you're introducing something else. The first word, Chaitya. Chaitya, that which is an object of consciousness, that which is observed, is an incidental factor, just like my hand is incidental to the pot. That which is observed is incidental to consciousness. Let me say that again. Just as my hand is incidental and separate from the pot, in the same way, whatever is observed, chaitya, is incidental and separate from chit, consciousness. Therefore, when we say Atma is sakshi, a wareful witness, the translation here is accurate. It is an incidental attribute. It is a tatastha lakshana. The term here, upalakshana, means tatastha lakshana. It is not a sarupa lakshana. Sakshi is not your essential nature. Because what happens when there's nothing to... Look at this. If let me back up a little bit. If the pot in my hand was sarupa lakshana, if it was not incidental, it means in the absence of my hand, there would be no pot. That doesn't make any sense at all. In the same way, if sakshi was a sarupa lakshana, it would mean in the absence of something to observe, consciousness wouldn't exist. But we know that in the absence of something to observe, something which is chaitya, we know that consciousness continues to exist, as in samadhi, as in deep sleep, as in after you die. Consciousness is unborn, unchanging, and not subject to death. So, therefore, our author says, upalakshanam eva iyam, this position, this teaching that Atma is sakshi, this teaching is upalakshanam eva. It is merely an indicator, and specifically a tatastha lakshana. It indicates an incidental attribute. Consciousness, when associated with an object of consciousness, is sakshi. But that's an incidental attribute. When consciousness is not associated with an object of consciousness, you can't call it sakshi. You have to go for other words like chit or chaitanya, consciousness, awareness. Then he gives us lovely metaphor. Metaphor actually we'll see in the next verse as well. He says, upalakshanam eva iyam. This is merely an incidental attribute of what? Of what? Nistaranga chit ambudhehe. I'm breaking the words apart for you. Chit ambuddhi. Chit, consciousness. Here, ambuddhi is one of our many words for ocean. An ocean of consciousness. This is a metaphor that's often used. It's a lovely metaphor. The ocean is vast. Your consciousness is vast. As we've discussed, your consciousness isn't stuck inside your head, not stuck inside your body. Your experience is limited to your body because of your nerves, but consciousness, remember the logic? Consciousness has no size, no dimension. That which has no size or dimension has no edge or boundary. That which has no edge or boundary is limitless. That which is limitless is all-pervasive, like space. Here the word ocean is used. Relatively speaking, ocean is limitless. You can't see to the far shore of the ocean. In terms of your sight, it looks limitless. So therefore it's used here as a metaphor. Chid ambudehe, for that ocean of consciousness, that ocean of consciousness, which is nistaranga. Taranga, you might know, is a wave. Nistaranga, without wave. So he says that the status of Atma being Sakshi is upalakshana. It's an incidental attribute for the ocean of consciousness which has no waves. Now this has to be explained a little bit. A metaphor that we've often used. Not sure if we've used it in this class yet. I think we've definitely used it in our classes on Atma Bodha, where we've described vritti, you remember, is a word we use for a mental event. Vrittis could be thoughts, vrittis can be emotions, vrittis can be sensations, whatever you see, hear, taste, smell, or touch. All these arise in your mind. Whatever arises in your mind is a vritti. So arises in what? And here's our metaphor. All these vrittis are like waves arising in the ocean of consciousness. We use this metaphor quite often. Vritti is a wave that arises in the ocean of consciousness. This is a very important teaching. There's actually a lot involved in this teaching. What it shows is that the content of the vritti is consciousness. Just like the content of a wave. In that ocean, there are so many waves, but every wave is nothing but water, right? Every wave is made of water. Every wave is nothing but water. In the same way, every thought, every emotion, every vritti in your mind is nothing but a form of consciousness. Just as a wave in the ocean is water with a particular form, in the same way, every vritti is consciousness with a particular form. Now, here's what he's saying here is waves are incidental attributes of the ocean. The ocean, fundamentally speaking, is water. In the ocean, what is there in addition to water? There's nothing in addition to water. There's only water. But we experience waves, we see waves. Those waves are incidental. They're not real. The waves remember our definition of real is that which doesn't come and go. Well, waves are born in the ocean, waves are sustained in the ocean, waves resolve into the ocean. So those waves are not as real as the ocean. The ocean is absolutely real. The ocean is a reality because of which the waves exist. In the same way, your consciousness is the underlying reality because of which all your vrittis exist. Your consciousness is the underlying reality because of which all your experiences exist. After all, everything you experience happens in your mind in the form of vrittis. Consciousness is the underlying reality. And the point here then is that the waves in the ocean are not as real as the ocean, they're incidental. The vrittis in your mind are not as real as the consciousness, so the vrittis are incidental. And now just to tie it all together, one of those vrittis is called sakshi. When you observe something, to be an observer, like right now you're observing me. To be an observer of me requires a vritti in your mind where you assume the status of observer and you observe me. That status of being an observer Sakshi, sakshita is the term he correctly used. The status of being observer, sakshita, is a condition of your mind. It is a vritti, and it comes and goes. For example, if you stop watching this video and have a snack, you will now then be enjoying the snack and no longer observing me. Instead of having the status of being sakshi, observer of me, while you're eating your snack, you will be a bhokta, an enjoyer, someone who's enjoying the snack. So you can see the status of being a sakshi comes and goes. It is a vritti in your mind. It is incidental. And anything that's incidental is not as real as its underlying reality. This is a theme we're going to see as we move ahead. So, the status, just to finish this up then, the status of being a sakshi, just to come back here. The status of being a sakshi, to call Atma sakshi, is a tatastha lakshana. To say, you are the awareful witness of everything happening in your mind, that is a tatastha lakshana. It indicates your true nature using an incidental attribute, as opposed to if we say that your true nature is consciousness. To say that your true nature is consciousness is a swarupa lakshana. It doesn't indicate something incidental. It indicates your swarupa. It indicates your true nature. Okay. Then, Amritabdir name jirnir, Amritabdir name jirnir, Mrishadindira janmabhi, Mrishadindira janmabhi, Spatikardrer name ragaha, Spatikardrer name ragaha, Swapna sandhya bravibramaihi, Swapna sandhya bravibramaihi. Sorry, my voice is funny. So that metaphor of the chit abdi, the ocean of awareness, that metaphor is carried over here. But instead of saying chid abdi, ocean of consciousness, he instead uses amritabdi, amrita abdi. And here in a genitive case, amritabder or amritabdehe. For the ocean, here not ocean of consciousness, ocean of amrita. Amrita, sometimes it's called nectar, but the literal meaning of amrita, as you probably know, is immortality, not nectar. It happens to mean nectar only secondarily. It is believed that there's some nectar you can drink which makes you immortal. So therefore, amrita is secondarily understood as that nectar, but its primary meaning is immortality. So this ocean of consciousness is an ocean of immortality. Why? Well, go back to the prior discussion. Waves come and go, not water. Relative to the transient waves, water, figuratively speaking, is immortal. In the same way, relative to the vrittis that constantly are changing in your mind, relative to those changing vrittis, your consciousness is amrita, immortal, doesn't come and go. So, me amritabdehe, me, for me, for what kind of me? Amritabdehe, for me, the ocean of immortality. Na jirnir, jirnihi is aging. Decay, isn't that a better translation? There is no decay, najirnihi, there is no decay, me, for me, amritabdehe, for me, the ocean of immortality. Notice those waves the waves in the ocean are constantly being born, and then they age very quickly, I suppose, and then they decay, they disappear into the ocean. So they're constant, just like a human being is born, ages, and dies. In the same way, these waves in the ocean are born, they decay, and they die. But in that process, when waves are born, decay, and die, what happens to water? Obviously, not a thing happens to water. Okay, so me, for me, amritabdehe, for me, the ocean of immortality, na jirnihi, there is no decay. No decay, which is mrisha dindira janmabihi. No decay, which is caused by janmabihi, by the arising, by the birth of dindira, literally bubbles or foam, which is mrisha, which is false. Here the metaphor is being shifted a little bit. Instead of waves in the ocean, how about if we just talk about foam or bubbles in the ocean? Same thing, right? A wave is nothing but water. A bubble or foam is nothing but water. It's just a different form. So sometimes you have the form of a wave, sometimes you have the form of a bubble, sometimes you have the form of foam. In each case, they're all forms of water. But what's significant is waves come and go, bubbles come and go, foam comes and goes, but not water. And what's significant about this is waves can maybe stay around for some time. You can imagine a wave traveling across the ocean and having some length of time that it persists, that it lasts. But how long do bubbles last? How long does foam last? Very brief, which is why he adds the adjective here, mrisha, false. So false meaning, well, going back to our definition of real, trikala abaditam satyam, our definition of real is that which persists in the past, present, and future. Well, anything that doesn't persist in past, present, and future then is not satyam, it is mrisha, it is false, and certainly the foam and bubbles don't persist long at all. So they are mrisha dindra janma bihi. So there is no jirnihi, no decay, which is the result of the birth of bubbles and foam, which last but a very brief time. Interesting. I scribbled some notes on these pages before class, and here, consider the fact that there are times when imagine an ocean free from waves. And generally the ocean is accompanied by waves and bubbles and foam. But you can also imagine an ocean that's perfectly still, a perfectly calm ocean. What does that perfectly calm, an ocean with no waves, no foam, no bubbles? What does that perfectly calm ocean indicate? It indicates a perfectly silent, it indicates consciousness in the absence of vrittis. Vrittis are those waves. Consciousness in the absence of vrittis is like the perfectly still ocean. When is consciousness in the absence of vrittis? Well, in samadhi and deep sleep, examples we gave before. Also, after you die, no waves in your consciousness when you're dead. So the condition of absolute stillness. Just as that water remains in the ocean perfectly still, in the same way in samadhi, in deep sleep, and after death, consciousness remains perfectly still. Just a kind of confusion here. What about after enlightenment? After enlightenment, does consciousness remain perfectly still? Do you see the problem with that conclusion? If you got enlightened and your consciousness remained perfectly still consciousness is like being in deep sleep. Perfectly still consciousness is like being in samadhi. Perfectly still consciousness is like being dead. That's not enlightenment. So enlightenment, properly understood, is not freedom from vrittis. It's freedom in spite of vrittis. It means you know that the vrittis in your mind don't affect your consciousness. Just as the waves, bubbles, and foam in the ocean don't affect water. Water remains water. In the same way, the vrittis in your mind, even vrittis of sadness and pain, those vrittis don't affect consciousness. To understand that in a very personal, direct, immediate way, that understanding is enlightenment. Not the absence of vrittis, but knowing that, to use the language you used before, to know that vrittis are not as real as you, and that which is not as real as you can't hurt you. The rope snake can't hurt you. The vrittis in your mind can't hurt you. Okay, let's finish this verse. Spatikardrer name ragaha swapna sandhya abra vibramaihi. This is actually another metaphor. In fact, it's parallel. If you're a Sanskritist, you'll see that it's a parallel structure to the first half. The first half says name jirnihi, there's no decay for me. And here, in the second half, name ragaha. And here, for me, there is no raga. And here, raga means taint. In fact, raga, you probably know raga as desire or attraction. But the root meaning of raga comes from a root meaning run, which is runge. Runge is a root meaning to color, to taint. So here, raga is used in the sense of tainting. So first half, name jirnihi, for me there is no decay. Second half, name ragaha, for me there is no taint. First half said there's no decay for me. Why? Because I am the ocean of immortality. Here we get a different metaphor. There's no raga, there's no taint for me. Because, why? Because I am spatika ardri. Ardri is mountain. Spatika is crystal. So spatika ardri, spatikardrehe, for the mountain of crystal, which is literally correct. But here we need to go a little bit into, little Sanskrit is required here. What is this mountain of crystal? Almost all of you have heard about Mount Kailash. In Sanskrit, Kailasa. So the name Kailasa comes from the noun Kailasa. Kailasa means crystal. Kailasa is the crystal mountain. And I suspect what it's a reference to is the fact that the top of Kailasa is covered with snow throughout the year. It's never free from snow. It's always white and highly reflective. I think that's where the sense of crystal comes in here. So that white snow-tipped mountain, Mount Kailasa, here is called Spatika Ardri. The mountain of crystal is Mount Kailasa. So it says that I am like a mountain of crystal. What does that mean? I'm like Mount Kailasa. Well, there are two meanings. One, we'll get the second meaning in the last line. First meaning is mountains are typical examples of that which doesn't change. Mountains don't change. They don't move. They don't go anywhere. The unchanging nature of the mountain represents the unchanging nature of your consciousness. As the commentator says, nirvikalpa chaitanya. Chaitanya consciousness, which is nirvikalpa, free from vikalpa, free from change, free from modifications of any kind. So one purpose of this metaphor is to say that your consciousness is as unchanging as a mountain. But he uses this word raga, taint, and it's with regard to a metaphor that we see in the last line. What is this raga caused by? The taint, the tainting of the mountain of crystal. The tainting of the mountain of crystal is caused by swapna sandhya abra vibramaihi. We have to break all these words apart. Set the word swapna aside. It means of sleep, relating to sleep. So just set that aside and just stay with sandhya abra vibrama. Sandhya, evening. Abra is cloud. Sandhya abra, sandhyabra, evening clouds. Well, clouds in the evening at sunset turn what color? Red? Orange? You know that very well. So sandhyabra, clouds at evening, are red or orange in color. And they have vibrama, they're moving. So the clouds, the moving orange-colored clouds at evening, where do these clouds congregate? Clouds often congregate around mountain peaks. So imagine Mount Kailasa with its peak, its white crystal-like peak, is surrounded by orange clouds, and the orangeness of the clouds is reflected by the whiteness of the peak. That's the metaphor. It's rather an obscure metaphor, but you can get it. So these orange-tainted clouds taint, that's that word raga. They impart their color to that clear crystal, that white crystalline peak of Mount Kailasa. But, as you know very well, the tainting of the clouds is an apparent tainting. The snow doesn't really become red or orange, of course not. The snow remains white. The snow remains crystalline in nature and isn't affected in any way by that orange or red taint of the clouds. You see the taint, but the mountain remains taintless. So he says that name ragaha, there is no tainting for me. And here, this is a topic we've talked about several times. The sadness in your mind does not taint your consciousness. I've said those words several times in this class, and many times in our prior Atma Bodha class. The sadness of a vritti in your mind does not rub off on, does not taint your consciousness. Just as that white peak remains untainted by the redness and orangeness of the clouds, even though the peak seems reddish or orange, but the snow remains utterly untainted by that orangeness. In the same way, your consciousness remains like that spatika, remains perfectly clear. This is our more usual way of explaining it. This clear crystal remains utterly unaffected by the orangeness of my cloth. This is a more familiar metaphor. The metaphor of this verse is the crystalline snowy peak of Mount Kailasa remains utterly unaffected by the orangeness of the mountains, that's of the orangeness of the clouds that surround it in the evening. And here that word swapna means of a dream. The commentator explains it as ignorance. It's only due to ignorance that you think the top of the mountain became orange. If you think the top of Mount Kailasa turns orange each evening, that statement is born of ignorance. And if you think your consciousness is tainted in any way whatsoever by the sadness, agitation, frustration, whatever it is in your mind, if you think any of that taints your consciousness, you're mistaken. Such conclusions are born of ignorance, and that's what our author wants us to understand here. And so with these verses, we understand that your consciousness is nirvikalpa. Nirvikalpa, unchanging. And just as I've said before, I'll say it one more time before we conclude. If your consciousness is subject to changing, if your consciousness is subject to change, you can't avoid suffering. So when that sad vritti is present in your mind, if your consciousness changes in response to that vritti, you will suffer. But because your consciousness is nirvikalpa, unchanging, you are fundamentally unaffected by anything and everything that happens in your mind and anything and everything that happens around you in the world. That's a good place to stop for today. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.